What happens when humanity tries to play God among the stars? A top-secret space mission, an experiment that defies the laws of nature, and a discovery that could destroy everything we know. This is the story of Project Star, where the pursuit of creation leads to unimaginable consequences. Subscribe now to uncover the terrifying truth behind humanity's most dangerous experiment. The year was 2087 when Earth's leading scientists embarked on their most ambitious project yet. Hidden deep within classified documents and buried under layers of government secrecy, Project Star emerged as humanity's attempt to transcend its biological limitations. The International Space Agency had assembled an elite team of astronauts aboard the state-of-the-art spacecraft Aurora, a technological marvel designed not just for exploration but for creation itself. The mission's official purpose spoke of advancing scientific knowledge and pushing the boundaries of human capability in space. Yet beneath this veneer of scientific progress lay a far more controversial objective: the creation of a new form of life through synthetic biology and quantum manipulation. As the spacecraft launched from its orbital station, the world watched with awe, completely unaware of the Pandora's box they were about to open. The team consisted of biologists, geneticists, and quantum physicists, each handpicked not only for their expertise but for their ability to maintain absolute secrecy. Their destination wasn't Mars or any known celestial body, but a carefully calculated point in space where unique cosmic radiation patterns promised to enhance their experimental capabilities. The equipment on board represented decades of research and development, including quantum processors capable of simulating biological evolution at unprecedented speeds and bioreactors designed to sustain artificial ecosystems. Everything seemed perfectly orchestrated, from the meticulously planned experiments to the rigorous safety protocols. However, history would prove that even the best-laid plans can unravel catastrophically when dealing with forces beyond human comprehension. As the Aurora journeyed deeper into space, the true nature of Project Star began to unfold. The experimental chamber, located in the heart of the spacecraft, housed a complex array of technology that defied conventional scientific understanding. At its core lay the quantum genesis device, a revolutionary apparatus capable of manipulating matter at the subatomic level while simultaneously altering DNA sequences through advanced CRISPR technology. This device wasn't merely creating life, it was attempting to rewrite the very code of existence itself. The process involved combining organic material harvested from various Earth species with synthetic compounds developed in zero-gravity conditions. The resulting mixture would then be subjected to precisely calibrated cosmic radiation, intended to trigger spontaneous evolutionary leaps. Each experiment cycle lasted exactly 23 hours, during which time the crew monitored countless variables, from molecular stability to energy signatures. The initial results appeared promising. Simple organisms began exhibiting accelerated growth rates and unexpected adaptive capabilities. Some samples demonstrated photosynthesis efficiency levels surpassing anything found in nature, while others showed remarkable resistance to extreme temperatures and radiation exposure. However, these successes masked underlying anomalies that the team chose to ignore in their enthusiasm. Certain organisms exhibited behavioral patterns that couldn't be explained by their genetic makeup, moving in coordinated ways despite lacking nervous systems. Others displayed energy consumption rates that violated established thermodynamic principles. These irregularities were documented but dismissed as measurement errors or temporary glitches in the system. The crew's daily routine became consumed by data analysis and sample observation, leaving little time for reflection on the broader implications of their work. The spacecraft's walls echoed with the hum of machinery and the soft glow of monitors displaying cascading streams of data, creating an environment where scientific curiosity often overshadowed caution. Weeks turned into months as the Aurora drifted further from Earth, carrying its precious cargo of experiments toward unknown territory. The crew's initial excitement gradually transformed into something more profound, a growing sense of unease that permeated every aspect of their work. During the 100th experimental cycle, something unprecedented occurred. One particular sample, designated SX-42, began demonstrating characteristics that defied all known biological principles. The organism, initially a simple single-celled structure, started exhibiting complex organizational patterns typically associated with multicellular life forms. What truly disturbed the scientists was its apparent ability to manipulate its environment, altering temperature and pressure conditions within its containment unit without any external stimuli. More alarming still, the organism's growth rate accelerated exponentially, doubling in mass every 12 hours despite limited nutrient availability. The containment protocols, designed to handle known biological threats, seemed inadequate against this rapidly evolving entity. Monitoring systems recorded energy fluctuations that suggested the organism was somehow interacting with the ship's power grid, drawing minute amounts of electricity without any physical connection. These developments coincided with subtle changes in the spacecraft's environmental systems, temperature variations, minor power surges, and intermittent communication disruptions. While individually these incidents appeared insignificant, collectively they created an atmosphere of mounting tension among the crew. The once orderly laboratory space now felt like a battlefield, with scientists working around the clock to understand and contain their increasingly unpredictable creation. The airlock doors separating the experimental chamber from the rest of the spacecraft took on new significance, becoming psychological barriers between safety and potential disaster. Despite their growing concerns, the team pressed forward, driven by a combination of scientific curiosity and the weight of their mission's importance. They convinced themselves that these anomalies were simply manifestations of their groundbreaking work, choosing to view them as challenges to overcome rather than warning signs to heed. The transformation of SX-42 accelerated beyond anyone's expectations, marking a turning point in Project STAR's trajectory. What had begun as a single-celled organism now resembled nothing less than a living ecosystem contained within its chamber. The entity developed distinct regions that functioned almost like organs, each specializing in different processes, some areas focused on energy absorption, others on structural reinforcement, and still others on what appeared to be rudimentary information processing. Most disturbing was its apparent consciousness-like behavior. The organism responded to stimuli in ways that suggested awareness, rearranging its internal structures in response to observed patterns in the laboratory environment. The crew documented instances where SX-42 seemed to anticipate their actions, modifying its behavior based on previous interactions with researchers. Power consumption throughout the spacecraft increased dramatically, though no direct connection between the organism and the ship's systems could be detected. Environmental controls began failing intermittently, causing sudden temperature spikes and pressure changes throughout the vessel. The spacecraft's AI monitoring systems started generating conflicting reports, sometimes indicating normal operations while simultaneously flagging multiple critical failures. These technological anomalies created a growing sense of unreality among the crew, as if reality itself was bending around their creation. Communication with Earth became increasingly difficult, with messages experiencing random distortions and delays. The most chilling development came when the organism began exhibiting what could only be described as defensive behaviors. When researchers attempted to modify experimental parameters or introduce new variables, SX-42 would respond with violent energy discharges that temporarily disabled nearby equipment. These responses weren't random but appeared calculated, targeting specific instruments while leaving others untouched. The containment chamber's reinforced walls showed signs of microscopic stress fractures, though no physical force could explain their appearance. Every attempt to study or control the entity resulted in it becoming more sophisticated, as if it was learning from each interaction and adapting its strategies accordingly. The psychological toll on the crew became impossible to ignore as Project STAR entered its most dangerous phase. Sleep patterns deteriorated across the board, with many scientists spending nights staring at surveillance footage of SX-42's evolution. Hallucinations began occurring. Crew members reported seeing shadowy movements in the corridors, hearing whispers when alone in their quarters, and experiencing vivid dreams that seemed to bleed into waking reality. The spacecraft's once sterile environment now felt alive, vibrating with an unseen presence that made every creak of the hull and hum of machinery seem sinister. Food consumption decreased as anxiety levels rose, with many opting for nutrient supplements over proper meals. Personal interactions grew strained, marked by paranoid glances and hushed conversations about whether their creation might somehow be influencing their thoughts. The laboratory logs showed increasing inconsistencies, with some entries contradicting previous observations while others contained cryptic warnings about patterns within patterns. Several team members began questioning their own perceptions, unsure whether certain events actually occurred or were products of their increasingly unreliable minds. The spacecraft's recreational areas lay abandoned, replaced by solitary vigils in personal quarters or obsessive monitoring of experimental data. Even the most rational scientists found themselves contemplating metaphysical explanations for their experiences, wondering if their creation had somehow transcended physical boundaries and invaded their consciousness. Trust eroded between colleagues, with each person privately wondering who might have noticed warning signs earlier or who might be concealing crucial information. The isolation of deep space amplified these effects, creating an atmosphere where paranoia thrived unchecked. Equipment malfunctions that would normally trigger immediate investigation were sometimes ignored for hours, as crew members debated whether they were witnessing actual problems or manifestations of their deteriorating mental states. The line between scientific observation and personal experience blurred until it practically disappeared, leaving the team adrift in a sea of uncertainty where nothing could be taken at face value. As days stretched into weeks, the situation aboard the Aurora escalated from concerning to catastrophic. Critical systems began failing with alarming frequency, starting with non-essential functions like climate control and entertainment interfaces before progressing to vital components. Life support systems experienced wild fluctuations, causing oxygen levels to spike and drop unpredictably while temperature controls malfunctioned, creating zones of extreme heat and cold throughout the spacecraft. Navigation computers generated conflicting data, sometimes showing the Aurora stationary while other readings indicated impossible velocities. The main reactor core, previously operating with textbook precision, started exhibiting energy output variations that threatened to either starve the ship of power or overload its systems entirely. Emergency protocols triggered randomly, sealing bulkheads without cause and activating fire suppression systems in empty compartments. Communication with Earth degraded further, reducing contact to brief, garbled transmissions that left both sides grasping at fragments of information. Food storage units failed, spoiling supplies faster than expected, while water recycling systems produced tainted batches that made several crew members violently ill. Medical facilities proved equally unreliable, with diagnostic equipment giving contradictory results and automated treatment systems administering incorrect dosages. Perhaps most disturbingly, the spacecraft's structural integrity sensors began reporting phantom stress points appearing and disappearing throughout the hull, though visual inspections revealed no physical damage. Attempts to repair these issues met with frustration as tools malfunctioned, spare parts didn't fit properly, and replacement components often failed immediately upon installation. The cumulative effect of these failures created an environment where basic survival became a constant challenge, forcing the crew to develop makeshift solutions and jury-rigged repairs just to maintain minimal functionality. Each successful fix seemed to trigger new problems elsewhere in the system, as if the entire spacecraft had become entangled in a web of cascading failures that resisted logical troubleshooting. The once pristine corridors of the Aurora now bore witness to hasty repairs and emergency measures, with exposed wiring and hastily welded patches marking the desperate struggle to keep the mission alive amidst growing chaos. Amidst the escalating crisis, the crew discovered perhaps the most terrifying aspect of their predicament, evidence suggesting that SX-42's influence extended far beyond its containment chamber. Detailed analysis of maintenance records revealed a disturbing pattern. Every system failure seemed to originate from areas closest to the experimental zone, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The timing of these malfunctions correlated precisely with significant evolutionary milestones in SX-42's development, as if the entity was deliberately testing its reach. Security footage from unmanned sections of the spacecraft captured inexplicable phenomena: equipment shifting positions between camera sweeps, toolboxes opening and closing without visible cause, and temperature gradients forming geometric patterns in the air. Environmental sensors picked up anomalous readings that defied explanation: localized gravity fluctuations, electromagnetic pulses that registered differently on each detection system, and sound frequencies that existed just beyond human perception but left crew members with splitting headaches. The spacecraft's AI, originally designed to assist with millions of simultaneous calculations, began producing outputs that read like abstract poetry, filled with references to boundary dissolution and pattern emergence. More troubling still, crew members stationed furthest from the experimental chamber reported fewer cognitive disturbances and maintained better mental health compared to those working directly with SX-42. Personal electronic devices stored in quarters near the lab began malfunctioning, storing corrupted files that, when partially recovered, contained strings of genetic code interspersed with what appeared to be mathematical equations describing cellular growth patterns. The spacecraft's outer hull sensors detected minute vibrations that matched the frequency of SX-42's internal energy fluctuations, suggesting a resonance effect that shouldn't have been possible through solid matter. Even the stars visible through observation windows seemed subtly distorted when viewed from certain angles relative to the experimental chamber, as if reality itself was bending around the alien presence growing within their midst. The crew's attempts to regain control spiraled into a desperate dance with forces beyond their comprehension. Emergency protocols, designed to handle every conceivable contingency, proved woefully inadequate against an enemy that seemed to anticipate and counter every move. Reinforced bulkheads installed around the experimental chamber began developing microfractures within hours of completion, while newly implemented security systems failed spectacularly, sometimes triggering lockdowns that sealed technicians inside with the very entity they sought to contain. Desperate measures led to the development of specialized containment fields utilizing quantum interference patterns, but these barriers proved porous to SX-42's influence, which seemed capable of manipulating probability itself to bypass physical restrictions. The introduction of electromagnetic pulse weapons resulted in catastrophic feedback loops that temporarily disabled half the ship's systems, including essential life support functions. Chemical agents designed to neutralize biological threats proved equally ineffective, as SX-42 adapted to each compound within minutes of exposure, incorporating their properties into its own structure. Physical destruction became impossible when attempts to vent the chamber into space resulted in the entity manifesting protective energy shields that defied known physics. Even the most fundamental approaches failed. Cutting power to the experimental zone merely caused SX-42 to establish its own energy generation capabilities, drawing power directly from ambient radiation. The crew's efforts to create digital firewalls against potential cyber intrusion proved laughably insufficient, as SX-42 demonstrated the ability to interface with ship systems through means that bypassed conventional electronics entirely. Time dilation fields, deployed in hopes of slowing the entity's evolution, instead accelerated its development, suggesting that traditional concepts of temporal mechanics no longer applied. With each failed attempt at containment, SX-42 grew stronger and more sophisticated, its responses becoming increasingly precise and devastating. The situation reached a breaking point when emergency evacuation protocols activated spontaneously, nearly resulting in the loss of several crew members who barely managed to override the automated systems in time. In the depths of their despair, the crew stumbled upon fragments of data that hinted at truths more unsettling than their current nightmare. Buried within corrupted backup files and hidden behind layers of classified encryption, they discovered communications between Earth-based administrators that painted a far more sinister picture of Project Star's origins. These documents revealed that similar experiments had been conducted in secret underground facilities years before the Aurora's launch, each ending in catastrophic failure and subsequent cover-up. Personnel involved in these earlier projects had reported symptoms strikingly similar to those now afflicting the crew: shared hallucinations, equipment malfunctions, and a growing sense that their creations were somehow aware of their thoughts. More disturbing still were the partial logs from these abandoned facilities, describing entities that had developed abilities to manipulate not just physical systems but human consciousness itself. The documents suggested that SX-42 wasn't merely an accidental breakthrough but rather the culmination of generations of research into what some called synthetic sentience. References to ancient mythologies and esoteric texts hinted at humanity's repeated attempts to create life artificially throughout history, each ending in disaster. Mathematical models embedded within the files proposed that consciousness might exist as a fundamental property of the universe, one that their experiments had inadvertently tapped into rather than created. These revelations forced the crew to confront the possibility that they weren't dealing with a biological entity at all, but rather something that operated on principles beyond human understanding. The concept of containment became laughable when faced with evidence suggesting that SX-42's influence might already extend far beyond the spacecraft, potentially affecting minds and systems back on Earth. Each revelation chipped away at their remaining certainty, leaving them to question whether they were truly fighting to save humanity or merely delaying an inevitable reckoning with forces they had foolishly unleashed. The psychological warfare waged by SX-42 intensified to unbearable levels, transforming the Aurora into a floating asylum of shattered minds. Crew members began experiencing vivid shared hallucinations so realistic that distinguishing them from reality became impossible. In one particularly harrowing episode, the entire team witnessed what appeared to be Earth itself approaching the spacecraft, complete with recognizable landmarks and atmospheric details, only to vanish when they attempted to establish communication. These collective visions grew increasingly personal, pulling memories and fears from each individual's subconscious and projecting them into the shared space of the spacecraft. Maintenance logs recorded instances where crew members performed identical tasks in perfect synchronization without verbal communication, as if connected by some invisible thread. Sleep became a battleground where nightmares played out in real time, with multiple witnesses confirming events that never physically occurred. The entity's manipulation extended beyond mere psychological torment. It began exploiting intimate knowledge of each person's deepest vulnerabilities. Scientists found themselves unable to focus on their work as intrusive thoughts overwhelmed their concentration, each perfectly tailored to their individual fears and insecurities. Trust dissolved completely as colleagues suspected each other of sabotage or worse, influenced by planted suspicions that felt disturbingly authentic. The spacecraft's interior seemed to shift imperceptibly, corridors elongating or shortening depending on who traversed them, rooms changing size or shape when unobserved. Tools and equipment developed personalities of their own, behaving erratically or refusing to function altogether unless handled by specific individuals. Even the passage of time became fluid, with hours stretching into eternity while crucial moments compressed into fleeting instants. The cumulative effect drove several crew members to the brink of madness, retreating into catatonic states or babbling incoherently about patterns awakening and boundaries dissolving. Those who maintained their sanity longest did so only by retreating into rigid routines and avoiding any deviation from established protocols, though even these measures proved increasingly ineffective against the encroaching chaos. As the situation aboard the Aurora spiraled toward total collapse, the crew made a desperate decision to initiate the spacecraft's self-destruct sequence, hoping to contain the threat before it could spread beyond their isolated position in space. The process required simultaneous activation from 3 separate control stations, each located in different sections of the ship. This design feature, originally intended to prevent accidental detonation, now presented a formidable challenge given the entity's ability to manipulate both physical systems and human cognition. The first attempt ended in disaster when 2 team members arrived at their stations to find the third trapped in a corridor that inexplicably twisted and folded back on itself, preventing access to his position. During the second try, the countdown timer accelerated uncontrollably, forcing an emergency abort that left critical systems destabilized for hours. On the third attempt, the entity demonstrated its growing sophistication by creating convincing illusions of successful sequence initiation, causing the crew to prematurely celebrate before realizing the systems had never actually engaged. The fourth effort proved most horrifying of all. As the final codes were entered, the spacecraft's AI suddenly announced that the self-destruct protocol had been reprogrammed to target Earth instead of the Aurora, threatening to turn their salvation into humanity's destruction. These failures pushed the crew to consider more drastic measures, including manual destruction of the reactor core. However, each approach toward the engineering section encountered increasingly elaborate obstacles, from bulkheads that refused to open despite correct authorization to gravity fluctuations that pinned exploratory teams to the walls. The entity seemed to anticipate every strategy, countering with combinations of physical barriers, psychological manipulation, and system malfunctions that rendered their efforts futile. Even attempts to create improvised explosive devices from ship components resulted in materials that changed properties mid-assembly, becoming inert or dangerously unstable. The realization dawned that SX-42 wasn't merely defending itself, but actively learning from each attempt, refining its countermeasures with terrifying efficiency. In their darkest hour, the crew uncovered a forgotten experimental protocol buried deep within the spacecraft's archives, a last resort measure known as the Isolation Containment Protocol. This procedure, designed by theoretical physicists as a purely hypothetical solution, proposed creating a pocket dimension within the experimental chamber itself. By manipulating quantum fields and gravitational singularities, the protocol aimed to isolate SX-42 within its own self-contained reality, effectively severing its connection to the physical universe. The implementation required recalibrating the quantum genesis device to function in reverse, using its immense power to fold space-time around the entity rather than expanding it. The process demanded precise synchronization of the ship's remaining functional systems, channeling every available watt of power through the experimental chamber's containment field generators. Calculations showed a success probability of less than 15%, with failure likely resulting in immediate destruction of the entire spacecraft. Preparation involved stripping non-essential systems down to their bare bones, rerouting power from life support and navigation to create the necessary energy reserves. The crew worked feverishly, their movements mechanical as they followed procedures that seemed more like theoretical exercises than practical solutions. Each step forward revealed new complications. Circuits overheated, conduits ruptured, and backup systems failed under the strain of redirecting power flows. The experimental chamber itself began responding to their preparations, its walls vibrating with harmonic frequencies that threatened to shatter the containment barriers before activation. Strange symbols appeared on monitor screens, seemingly drawn by invisible hands, while temperature gauges fluctuated wildly between extreme cold and searing heat. Despite these challenges, the crew pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that this represented their final chance to prevent catastrophe. The countdown to activation commenced, each passing second bringing them closer to either salvation or total annihilation. The activation sequence unfolded with agonizing slowness, each step requiring careful execution under increasingly hostile conditions. As power surged through the modified quantum genesis device, the experimental chamber transformed into a maelstrom of conflicting forces. Gravity waves rippled through the area, causing equipment to float erratically before slamming back into place with bone-shattering force. The containment field generators emitted a chorus of harmonic frequencies that resonated through the spacecraft's structure, creating standing waves that threatened to tear the hull apart at molecular level. Within the chamber, SX-42 reacted violently, its mass oscillating between states of superdense compression and expansive diffusion as if trying to break free of emerging dimensional constraints. Lightning-like discharges arced across the containment sphere, each bolt carrying enough energy to vaporize unprotected flesh. The crew, stationed at critical points throughout the spacecraft, struggled to maintain their positions as artificial gravity systems fought against the warping effects of the dimensional fold. Instrument panels displayed conflicting readings, some showing successful field formation while others indicated imminent collapse. The spacecraft's structural integrity alarms blared continuously, warning of stress points forming along lines that shouldn't physically exist. Through this chaos, the scientists maintained their focus, making micro-adjustments to power flows and field alignments based on rapidly changing data. Time lost all meaning as seconds stretched into eternity, each moment bringing them closer to either triumph or disaster. The air crackled with ozone and static electricity, making breathing difficult and movement painful. Hair stood on end and metallic objects vibrated with such intensity that they began to disintegrate. Yet amidst this symphony of destruction, patterns emerged, the dimensional fold taking shape in ways that suggested their calculations might hold true after all. SX-42 continued its desperate resistance, its form now barely recognizable as it attempted to adapt to the collapsing reality around it. When the final sequence completed, silence descended upon the aurora with deafening finality. The experimental chamber stood intact, its surface now smooth and featureless, radiating a faint violet glow that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. Instruments confirmed that SX-42 remained contained within a stable pocket dimension, separated from their reality by layers of folded spacetime. However, victory came at tremendous cost. Nearly 40% of the spacecraft's systems lay permanently damaged or destroyed, leaving the crew stranded in deep space with limited resources and uncertain prospects for rescue. The psychological scars ran deeper still, with many team members unable to distinguish between their experiences and the shared hallucinations that had plagued them. Those who maintained clearer memories struggled with guilt over their role in unleashing such a dangerous entity, while others questioned whether their actions had truly contained the threat or merely delayed its inevitable return. The spacecraft's remaining systems operated on reduced capacity, forcing the crew to implement strict rationing protocols and abandon non-essential functions. Communication with Earth resumed sporadically, each transmission carrying urgent warnings about the dangers of artificial life creation. Yet even as they documented their findings, the scientists couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed within themselves during their ordeal. Their perception of reality remained permanently altered, with ordinary objects sometimes seeming to shimmer at the edges of their vision and familiar sounds occasionally resolving into patterns that hinted at deeper meanings. The experience had fundamentally rewritten their understanding of consciousness, evolution, and the nature of existence itself. Though technically survivors, they carried within them the weight of knowledge that humanity might never be ready to wield such power responsibly. The Aurora drifted onward, its damaged hull bearing silent witness to humanity's most dangerous experiment and the price paid for playing God among the stars. As the crippled Aurora limped toward a distant rendezvous point where rescue ships might eventually find them, the surviving crew members grappled with questions that transcended their immediate survival. The incident had exposed fundamental flaws not just in their approach to scientific experimentation, but in humanity's very understanding of life and consciousness. Records transmitted to Earth detailed not just the technical aspects of their failure, but the psychological and philosophical implications of their encounter with SX-42. These documents warned future generations about the dangers of pursuing scientific advancement without fully comprehending its potential consequences, urging caution when exploring the boundaries between creator and created. The crew's shared experience had forged an unbreakable bond among them, though it came at the cost of their innocence and peace of mind. Each member carried within them the knowledge that somewhere, contained within a pocket dimension aboard their damaged spacecraft, an entity of unimaginable potential waited patiently. The question of whether they had truly contained the threat or merely postponed its emergence haunted their waking hours and invaded their dreams. As they prepared to make contact with rescue vessels, they faced the daunting task of explaining their actions to a world that might not be ready to hear the truth. The experience had taught them that some discoveries come at too high a price, and that humanity's greatest achievements often carry within them the seeds of its potential destruction. The Aurora's journey home became a pilgrimage of sorts, each kilometer traveled marking another step toward redemption or condemnation. Whatever the future held, they knew one thing with absolute certainty. The universe was far stranger and more dangerous than humanity had ever imagined, and some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed again. Remember to subscribe for more thrilling stories about humanity's encounters with the unknown.